I lay there face down in the freezing Texas mud, the expensive fabric of my suit soaking through with filthy water, while my own son Brandon and his wife Scarlett stood under the porch light, laughing hysterically with their high society friends. They thought they had finally discarded the old man like a piece of broken furniture, erasing me from the very life I built for them with my bare hands. But as the rain poured over my face, my humiliation turned into absolute ice-cold clarity. They didn't realize that by throwing me out of my own house, they had just unlocked the door to their own total ruin. My name is Arthur Vance. If you met me a few years ago walking down the streets of Austin, Texas, you probably would have thought I was a man who had everything figured out. I spent 40 years of my life building a construction contracting business from the ground up. I wore calluses on my hands like a badge of honor, waking up at 4 in the morning, breathing in concrete dust, and negotiating multi-million-dollar commercial contracts. I did it all for one simple reason: family. I grew up with nothing, and I promised myself that the people I loved would never know the anxiety of an empty bank account or a looming eviction notice. I believed with every fiber of my being that if you poured your sweat and blood into protecting your family, that love would shield you when the winter of your life arrived. But the real winter hit me 3 years ago, not with snow, but with a phone call from the hospital. My beautiful wife, Helen, the woman who had packed my lunches in rusted metal tins when we were broke, passed away after a brutal battle with cancer. When she died, a massive part of my soul went with her. The big house we shared felt like an echo chamber. In my profound grief, I became vulnerable. I leaned heavily on the only piece of Helen I had left, our son Brandon. I wanted so desperately to keep him close, to feel like I still had a purpose, that I became completely blind to what he was becoming. I didn't see the greed taking root in his eyes, and I certainly didn't see the calculating malice of the woman he brought into our lives, his wife, Scarlett. I thought that by giving them everything, I was building a legacy of gratitude. I thought that ensuring their happiness would fill the empty void Helen left behind. I was wrong. I was setting the stage for my own execution, completely unaware that the boy I taught to walk would eventually watch me fall into the dirt without an ounce of pity. When Helen passed away, Brandon was 26, trying to find his footing in the real estate development market but drowning in debt. He had the ambition, but he lacked the discipline and the capital. Enter Scarlett. The moment she married into our family, the financial demands escalated. She didn't want a comfortable life. She wanted a life that looked perfect on camera, one that would turn heads in the upscale circles of West Austin. She constantly whispered in Brandon's ear, convincing him that his lack of success wasn't due to his poor work ethic, but because his old-fashioned father was holding back the family fortune. I wanted my son to succeed so badly it hurt, so I did what any loving father with the means would do. I made a massive sacrifice. I decided to retire early from the construction firm I loved. I didn't just step down. I liquidated a major portion of my company's liquid assets to hand Brandon a staggering $450,000 in cash. It was meant to be the ultimate launchpad for his own development business, a clean slate to build his dreams. I remember the day I wire transferred that money. Brandon hugged me with tears in his eyes, promising he would make me proud. Scarlett actually smiled at me, a rare, genuine-looking smile that I now realize was just the satisfaction of a wolf smelling blood. But the cash injection wasn't enough. Next came the housing situation. They were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, and Scarlett complained constantly that she couldn't entertain potential clients or network properly. Driven by a desire to have my family under one roof and to escape the suffocating loneliness of my empty house, I sold my old property. I took the proceeds and purchased a sprawling $1.2 million mid-century modern home in a premium Austin zip code, right near the hills. It was a beautiful estate, boasting a large courtyard, expansive glass windows, and a separate private guest suite at the back of the property. The legal paperwork was handled by my longtime attorney and friend Marcus. When we were setting up the purchase, Brandon subtly suggested that I put the deed directly in his name to protect the asset for the future generation. But 40 years in commercial construction taught me to never leave myself completely exposed. I told Brandon I wanted to keep it structured properly. Marcus set up a private family trust, the Vance Legacy Trust. The trust bought the house. I was the sole trustee, meaning I legally owned and controlled the property, but the trust dictated that upon my passing, The house would automatically transfer to Brandon. I thought this was the perfect compromise. It gave them a luxury place to live, guaranteed their inheritance, and kept me secure. I told them, live here, build your business, and don't worry about the rent. I assumed they would appreciate the massive financial breathing room. I even took it a step further. I committed to quietly paying the $12,000 annual property taxes and the exorbitant monthly utility bills out of my personal retirement accounts. I didn't want them stressed. I wanted them to focus entirely on their future. What I didn't realize was that by removing all financial pressure, I wasn't helping them grow. I was enabling their entitlement. To Scarlett, my presence in the house wasn't a blessing. It was a transaction she had already cashed in on. The $450,000 was gone into high-end office rentals and luxury cars to maintain their corporate image. The house was taken for granted, and I was quickly becoming an inconvenient reminder of the debt they owed to my generosity. I had built them a fortress of luxury, and in return they were already planning how to lock me out of the gates. It didn't happen overnight. The erosion of my dignity was a slow, calculated process, orchestrated by Scarlett and blindly executed by Brandon. It started with small things. Scarlett began redecorating the main house, and within months every single photograph of Helen and me was packed into cardboard boxes and moved to the back garage. When I asked about it, Scarlett didn't even look up from her tablet. She simply said, "Arthur, the mid-century modern aesthetic requires clean lines. Family collages look cluttered. We need this place to look professional for Brandon's clients." Brandon stood right next to her, nodding along, entirely silent. Gradually, I was pushed further and further into the margins of the estate I had paid for. The guest suite at the back of the property became my cage. I was no longer welcome in the main kitchen after 5 p.m. Scarlett claimed that my heavy footsteps and old-school cooking smells disturbed her evening meditation and interfered with her lifestyle vlogs. I found myself eating cold sandwiches in my room, listening to the muffled sounds of their laughter echoing from the main dining room, the very dining room table I had custom-ordered from an artisan in Austin. But the most toxic part of the dynamic was how they treated me like an embarrassing secret. Whenever Brandon's new real estate partners or Scarlett's high society friends came over, I was explicitly told to stay in the guest suite. "Arthur, these are high net worth individuals," Scarlett told me one afternoon, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that couldn't hide the venom beneath. "They talk about international investments and modern tech. Your old construction stories about pouring concrete in the 80s just don't fit the vibe. It makes Brandon look like he comes from blue-collar money, which hurts his corporate branding." My own son looked me in the eye and added, "Yeah, Dad, just hang out in the back tonight. We've got catering. You don't need to stress yourself out dealing with the crowd." I swallowed my pride. I told myself that young entrepreneurs had to project a certain image in a fast-paced city like Austin. I reminded myself that I was doing this for Helen's boy. So, I played the part of the invisible ghost. I stayed in the back, watching the shadows of strangers pass by my windows. What drove me mad was the sheer hypocrisy of it all. While I was being treated like an unwanted, embarrassing relic, my bank account was still the lifeblood of their luxury lifestyle. Every single month, the automatic drafts hit my retirement portfolio. The $1,000 electric bills for the central AC they blasted all day? Paid by me. The $12,000 annual property tax bill that arrived in a certified county envelope? Signed and paid by me. I even discovered that Scarlett had linked the main house's premium landscaping and pool maintenance services to my personal credit card, which I had left on file for emergencies. They were living like royalty on the bones of my 40-year career, yet they looked down on me as if I were a charity case occupying their space. Brandon's development business was faltering. He was spending more on leased sports cars and VIP club tables to impress clients than he was making on actual property flips, but instead of humbling himself, his anger turned outward, toward me. Every time he lost a bid or stressed over a payroll deadline, he would come to the guest suite, not to ask for advice, but to complain about how my outdated trust structures prevented him from leveraging the house for a massive bank loan. I realized then that to them I was no longer a father or a benefactor. I was just an obstacle standing between them and the full ownership of a $1.2 million piece of real estate. They didn't see the sweat it took to buy that land. They only saw a 65-year-old man whose presence compromised their aesthetic and whose survival delayed their absolute control. I kept waiting for a shred of the boy I raised to resurface, but the luxury walls I bought for him had completely insulated his heart from gratitude. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday in early July. The Texas heat had been suffocating all day, but by the evening, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a massive thunderstorm rolled over Austin. Inside the main house, however, the atmosphere was electric for an entirely different reason. Scarlett was hosting her annual summer networking gala, a high-profile corporate event designed to cement her status among the city's elite and secure new investors for Brandon's bleeding real estate firm. For weeks, I had been given strict orders to remain completely out of sight. I had spent the evening in my isolated guest suite, listening to the torrential rain lash against the glass windows, interspersed with the distant clinking of champagne flutes and the muffled bass of a jazz trio playing in the main living room. Around 9 p.m., the power in the guest suite flickered and died. The backup generator for the main house kicked in instantly, but my unit remained dark and stiflingly hot. Needing a simple flashlight and a bottle of water, I decided to quietly slip into the main house through the connecting utility corridor, making sure to avoid the main banquet hall. I was wearing my old comfortable flannel shirt and a pair of worn trousers, the clothes of a retired contractor, not a high society ghost. As I stepped into the secondary hallway near the kitchen, I was suddenly confronted by Scarlett. She was wearing an expensive silk designer dress, holding a glass of champagne, and laughing with a group of wealthy venture capitalists. The moment her eyes fell upon me, her face contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She excused herself from the group, grabbed my arm with surprising force, and dragged me into the pantry corridor, out of view of her guests. "What do you think you are doing, Arthur?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with venomous rage. "Look at you. You look like a homeless vagrant wandering through a five-star restaurant. I explicitly told you to stay in the back tonight. We have the city's top developers out there, and you are completely ruining the aesthetic of this event." "Scarlett, the power went out in my suite and it's 90 degrees in there," I replied calmly, trying to maintain my composure. "I just came to get a bottle of water from the kitchen. I built this house and I pay the utility bills that are currently keeping these lights on. I think I have the right to a glass of water." "You have no rights in this house anymore," she spat, her eyes flashing with malice. "You are nothing but a pathetic, outdated burden holding Brandon back from real success. Your presence is an embarrassment to our brand. We don't want you here, Arthur. We don't need you anymore. In fact, I want you gone. Tonight." Before I could even process her words, she marched out of the corridor. A few minutes later, she returned, but this time Brandon was walking right behind her. My heart sank as I looked at my son. He wouldn't meet my eye. He was looking at the floor, his face flushed from alcohol, completely subservient to his wife's demands. In his hand, he was carrying my vintage leather suitcase, the one Helen had bought me for our 25th anniversary. "Brandon," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "What is the meaning of this?" "Look, Dad," Brandon said, his voice shaking but devoid of any real warmth or remorse. "Scarlett is right. You're not fitting in with our lifestyle anymore. Every time we have people over, we have to hide you. It's exhausting. We need our space. We need to live our lives without you hovering over us like a shadow. I think it's best if you find somewhere else to live." "You're throwing me out, in the middle of a storm?" I asked, looking at the boy I had spent 40 years protecting. "Brandon, I liquidated my business for you. I bought this house for you. I pay the taxes." "We don't care about your past charity, Arthur," Scarlett interrupted, stepping between us. She grabbed the leather suitcase from Brandon's hand and marched directly toward the heavy mahogany front door. She threw the door open, revealing the pitch-black night and the blinding wall of Texas rain. Without hesitation, she hurled my vintage suitcase out into the dark. It crashed onto the wet lawn, the latches bursting open, scattering my clothes into the mud. "Get out," Scarlett commanded. In a state of sheer shock, I stepped forward, trying to push past her to retrieve my belongings and reason with my son. "Brandon, look at me! Look at your father!" I yelled over the sound of the thunder. But as I reached the threshold of the porch, Scarlett placed both of her hands firmly on my chest. With a vicious sneer, she gave me a powerful shove. My foot caught on the edge of the wet stone step and I went flying backward, crashing violently into the deep, saturated mud of the front lawn. The physical impact knocked the breath from my lungs. The freezing rainwater instantly soaked through my clothes and thick, filthy mud covered my face and hands. I struggled to sit up, wiping the wet dirt from my eyes. and looked up at the porch. Scarlett was standing there under the warm, glowing porch light, crossing her arms and laughing hysterically. And then I looked at Brandon, my own flesh and blood. He didn't rush down the steps to help his 65-year-old father up from the dirt. He didn't yell at his wife for committing an assault. Instead, he looked down at me, adjusted his expensive watch, and let out a cruel, supportive smile, eager to please his wife and prove to their wealthy friends inside that he was finally the undisputed master of the estate. "Don't come back, Arthur," Brandon called out over the rain. They slammed the heavy mahogany door shut, locking it from the inside. The porch light clicked off, plunging me into absolute darkness, leaving me alone in the Texas mud. I sat in the dark for what felt like an eternity, the heavy Texas rain hammering down on my shoulders, washing the thick mud off my face but embedding it deep into the fabric of my clothes. I slowly pulled myself up from the sodden lawn, my joints aching from the impact of the fall. I gathered my soaked garments, stuffing them back into the ruined leather suitcase with trembling hands. I didn't knock on the door again. I didn't scream, and I didn't shed a single tear. The deep, agonizing heartbreak I felt as I watched Brandon smile at my humiliation didn't make me weep. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It burned away every last ounce of parental guilt I had carried since Helen's death. I walked 2 miles down the dark, slick asphalt of the Austin Hills, the suitcase dragging beside me, until I reached a faded, low-budget motel off the highway. The receptionist gave me a look of pure pity as I handed over my identification, my clothes dripping dirty water onto the linoleum floor. Once the door to room 114 clicked shut behind me, the silence was deafening. I stripped off the ruined flannel shirt, walked into the bathroom, and began washing the remaining grit from my hands. I watched the brown, muddy water swirl down the white porcelain drain. As I wiped my hands clean, I looked at myself in the cracked bathroom mirror. The man looking back at me wasn't a defeated, elderly victim. The helpless, grieving widower who had spent 3 years letting himself be pushed into the corners of his own life was dead. He had died the exact second he hit the mud. Waking up in his place was the man I used to be, the ruthless, sharp-minded commercial contractor who had survived 40 years in one of the most cutthroat industries in Texas. I had negotiated contracts with billionaires, managed hundreds of roughnecks, and built an empire from absolute nothingness. Brandon and Scarlett thought I was weak because I was kind. They genuinely believed that their modern lifestyle titles and high society networking gave them an intellectual edge over a blue-collar father. They had completely forgotten that every single luxury they took credit for was sustained entirely by my intellect and my capital. I sat down at the small wooden desk in the corner of the motel room, the hum of the cheap AC unit filling the space. I pulled out my phone and looked at my bank application. I saw the automatic drafts pending for the main house's utilities. I saw the linked accounts. I looked at the mud stains still visible under my fingernails and felt a wave of ice-cold determination wash over me. Being a loving father had earned me a place in the dirt. It was time to stop being a father and start being a businessman. Brandon wanted to live in a world where everything was a transaction, where older generations were just liabilities to be cleared from the balance sheet. I was about to teach both of them a brutal, unforgettable lesson in asset management. I dialed the private cell number of Marcus, my longtime corporate attorney. It was past 11 p.m., but Marcus answered on the second ring. "Arthur, is everything okay?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with concern. "Marcus," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any anger or sorrow. "I need you to open up the files for the Vance Legacy Trust first thing tomorrow morning and pull up the 2024 commercial credit guarantee I signed for Brandon's firm. We are restructuring everything." There was a brief pause on the line before Marcus replied, "Arthur, what happened?" "They wanted me out of their life, Marcus," I whispered, looking out the window at the rain. "So I'm taking my life back, all of it." At exactly 8 a.m. the next morning, I walked into Marcus's downtown Austin office. I was wearing a fresh suit I bought from a department store down the street from the motel. Marcus took one look at my face and didn't ask any questions. He simply laid out the legal files on his heavy oak desk. "Brandon and Scarlett have made a fatal assumption, Arthur," Marcus said, adjusting his glasses as he pulled up the deed to the property. "They assumed that because they live in the house and because their name is on the mailbox, they have tenant rights or ownership leverage. But they forgot how we structured the Vance Legacy Trust." I leaned forward, looking at the black and white legal text. "Walk me through it, Marcus, no mistakes." "The house is owned 100% by the trust," Marcus explained, pointing to the signatures. "You are the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary during your lifetime. Brandon is merely a contingent beneficiary, meaning he gets nothing until you pass away. Furthermore, there is an explicit clause stating that any occupants residing in trust property do so entirely at the discretion of the trustee, without the creation of a formal tenancy, provided the trustee pays the carrying costs. Because they physically assaulted you and removed you from the property, you have immediate irrefutable grounds to execute an expedited eviction notice for unlawful occupancy. I can have a process server at the house by noon." "Do it," I said, my voice steady. "Give them 7 days, not a single hour more." "What about Brandon's company, Vance Development LLC?" Marcus asked. "That's step 2, I replied, pulling out a folder of corporate bank statements. In 2024, when Brandon wanted to expand his business to impress Scarlett's wealthy friends, he didn't have the collateral to secure a commercial line of credit. The bank refused him. I stepped in and signed a personal guarantee, putting up $300,000 of my own liquid retirement bonds as collateral to back his operational funds. That line of credit is the only reason his suppliers ship him materials on credit." I looked Marcus dead in the eye. "Can I revoke the guarantee?" Marcus smiled faintly, a cold, professional smile. "There is a standard revocation clause for the guarantor. If you feel the borrower is exposing you to financial risk, you can execute an immediate withdrawal of your collateral for any future drawdowns. Since it's a rolling line of credit, the bank will instantly freeze the account to protect themselves. They will give Brandon 48 hours to replace the $300,000 collateral, or they will call in the entire outstanding balance." "Draft the revocation letter immediately," I ordered. "Hand-deliver it to the regional vice president at the bank before lunch." By 1 p.m. that afternoon, I sat in a quiet coffee shop across from the bank, watching the digital ledger on my phone. The first strike hit at 2:15 p.m. I received an automated alert from my primary financial institution. Personal guarantee revoked. Collateral retracted. Within 30 minutes, my phone began to vibrate violently. It was Brandon. I let it ring, watching his name flash on the screen until it went to voicemail. 10 minutes later, Scarlett tried to call. I blocked both of their numbers instantly. The second strike landed the next day. I knew exactly how Scarlett operated. She spent every Thursday afternoon at an upscale designer boutique in North Austin, flaunting her status. I had quietly logged into my personal credit card portal, the one she had secretly linked to the estate's high-end maintenance services, and noticed she had also added herself as an authorized user on a secondary corporate card I kept open. I didn't just report the card stolen. I waited until 3 p.m. on Thursday, the exact time she would be at the checkout counter, and called the fraud department to instantly terminate the account. Later that evening, Marcus sent me a text message with a scanned confirmation page. Eviction notice officially served at 4:30 p.m. The clock is ticking. For the next 5 days, I stayed in a premium hotel overlooking the Austin skyline, watching the chess pieces fall exactly where I calculated. Without my $300,000 guarantee, the bank froze Brandon's business accounts. Because his accounts were frozen, a major lumber supplier canceled a shipment for his only active residential flip, triggering a breach of contract penalty from his investors. Brandon's entire corporate house of cards, built on a foundation of my stolen generosity, was imploding under its own weight. They had thrown me into the mud because they thought I was a helpless liability. Now they were realizing that I wasn't the liability, I was the entire foundation. On the 7th day, the Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt of the West Austin hills. At exactly 4 p.m., the legal deadline for the eviction notice expired. I arrived at the estate not in a state of anger, but in the back of a sleek black town car I had hired for the afternoon. As the driver pulled up the long, winding driveway, the scene before me was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The manicured front lawn, the very lawn where I had been shoved into the dirt just a week prior, was cluttered with cheap, mismatched cardboard boxes and plastic storage bins. There were no luxury moving vans, no high society friends helping them, and no catering crews. Brandon's high-end sports car was conspicuously missing, likely repossessed by the dealership the moment his business accounts were frozen. Instead, a battered, rented moving truck sat idling in the driveway. Scarlett was standing next to a stack of boxes, her designer dress replaced by stained sweatpants, her face streaked with tears and sweat as she frantically argued with a man holding a clipboard, a representative from the sheriff's department ensuring the court order was enforced. Brandon stood beside her, his head buried in his hands, looking completely defeated, his shoulders slumped in the exact posture of a man who had realized he ruined his own life. As my town car came to a smooth halt near the porch, both of them froze. Brandon's eyes went wide as the rear window slowly rolled down just an inch, revealing my face. He broke away from Scarlett and ran toward the car, pressing his hands against the warm glass of the door. "Dad, Dad, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't do this to us. The bank called in the entire line of credit. My suppliers are suing me, the investors pulled out, and we have absolutely nowhere to go. We're going to lose everything, Dad. Scarlett and we were just stressed that night. We didn't mean it. Please just tell the sheriff to stop. Give us a chance." Scarlett ran up behind him, her arrogance completely shattered, her voice trembling as she looked at me through the gap in the window. "Arthur, please. I'm sorry. We can fix this. You can have the main bedroom. Just don't throw us out on the street." I looked at them through the narrow opening. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but I felt an absolute, unshakable sense of justice. I looked at Brandon, my own flesh and blood, who had stood by and smiled while I lay face down in the freezing rain. "When you pushed me into the mud, Brandon," I said, my voice incredibly quiet, yet cutting through his hysterical sobbing like a razor blade, "you threw away the only man holding up your roof. You and Scarlett wanted a life built entirely on appearances and ruthlessness. Well, now you have it. You don't have an old, embarrassing father holding you back anymore. You have exactly what you earned." "Dad, please, I'm your son!" Brandon screamed, tears streaming down his face as the sheriff's deputy began walking toward the car to clear the driveway. "A son protects his father," I replied coldly. "You're just a businessman who made a very bad investment. Learn to carry your own weight." I pressed the button on the door panel. The heavy glass window rolled back up, sealing out their cries and the sound of Scarlett's desperate apologies. I tapped the front partition, signaling the driver. The black town car smoothly shifted into reverse, turning around on the wide driveway, crushing a fallen cardboard box under its tires as we began our descent down the hill. I looked back through the rear window one last time. Brandon and Scarlett were standing by their rented truck, surrounded by their scattered belongings on the edge of the street, completely evicted from the paradise they had tried to steal from me. As the car turned onto the main highway heading toward my new penthouse apartment downtown, the weight of 3 years of grief and humiliation finally lifted from my chest. I breathed in the clean air of my new life, entirely independent, entirely secure, and finally free. Sitting in my new home today, looking out at the Austin skyline, I finally have the peace I thought I lost the night my own son pushed me into the mud. If there is one thing this journey taught me, it's that you can love your children with all your heart, but you can never allow your kindness to become your weakness. Real family protects you, they don't exploit you. Karma has a beautiful way of balancing the scales, and today I am finally free. But looking at what happened to me, I have to ask you, do you think I did the right thing by evicting them? What would you have done in my place? Let me know in the comments below. And if you learned something valuable from my story, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to join us daily.